I opened Dean's laptop to start the holiday playlist I always used when I dressed the townhouse for Christmas. And the first thing waiting on the screen was not music at all. It was a reservation confirmation for a suite on the 41st floor of a hotel off Michigan Avenue. 2 guests. Checked in tonight. Billed through a vendor account from his firm. I read it 3 times because the account code was one I had seen on donor event paperwork before. And that single detail stripped the lie down to something cold and usable. My phone lit up almost at the same moment with an unknown number. And when I opened it, there was no message attached. No explanation. No warning. Only a photograph. Dean stood under amber bar light with a champagne glass half raised. And Brielle Sutton was pressed against his side, with one hand resting on his sleeve, like she had practiced belonging there. I did not call him again after that because the suite confirmation was evidence. The vendor billing was evidence. And the photograph in my hand meant I was no longer dealing with suspicion. I took my wallet, my keys, my personal hard drive, and the leather notebook where I had been hiding every design sketch I had made during the last 15 months. The tree was still lit in the front room. The dining table was still set for Christmas Eve. And the whole house still looked exactly the way Dean liked it to look. That was the part that landed hardest. Not simply that he was with her, but that the room was still carrying my labor while he was already somewhere else preparing a woman to replace me. By the time I stepped into the snow with one bag over my shoulder, I understood that photograph had not been sent to confess anything or even to hurt me cleanly. It had been sent to move me out of position before New Year donor season, before the private dinners started again, and before Brielle stepped neatly into the social place I had built. I walked toward Megan Price's condo in Old Town without looking back because once I saw the suite charge, the vendor code, and Brielle's hand on his arm, there was nothing left to misunderstand. Megan opened the door before I knocked twice, took one look at my bag, my coat, and my face, then stepped aside and said, "Come in." Her condo was warm, spare, and lit by one lamp over the kitchen counter, which made the whole room feel steadier than I did. I set my bag down, handed her my phone, and watched her read the hotel confirmation, the vendor billing, and the photograph without interrupting once. When she looked up, I told her this had not started tonight. Not really. Because Dean had been building this ending in pieces small enough to survive denial. He had spent years using the language of stability to edge me out of my own life. First my hours, then my work, then the parts of me that existed outside him. He liked introducing me at dinners as the woman with taste, the one who made rooms feel finished. And I see now that even praise was part of the framing. I told Megan about the receipts that never made sense, the work trips that came back polished but thin, and the way every direct question left me apologizing. Dean never needed to raise his voice when disappointment would do more damage, and he had a talent for making suspicion feel like a flaw in me. By the time I found the suite charge tonight, the pattern was already there in full, because every missing explanation behind it had arrived earlier and quietly stayed. Megan leaned against the counter, gave the photograph back, and asked one thing in a voice so level it cleared the room. "What do you still have that is yours?" I thought about the vendor code on the reservation, about Brielle's hand on Dean's sleeve, and about the fact that I had walked out carrying my hard drive first. That was when I understood I was not sitting in her kitchen as a woman who had just lost everything, but as a woman who had already begun hiding one life from the man who thought he owned all of it. I opened the hard drive on Megan's kitchen table and pulled up the folders I had named so plainly Dean would never have noticed what they were if he had ever looked. 15 months earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon after wiping red wine from the dining room runner after one of his client dinners, I created a private email under the name M. Renand uploaded the first set of design boards I had made in years. What began as a hidden place to store work became something else when a small studio in Fulton Market wrote back, asking whether M. Ren could revise circulation plans for a boutique hospitality launch on a compressed timeline. I showed Megan the signed project agreements. The clean invoice trail, the email chains with timestamps, and the wire confirmations that proved the work had not been imagined after tonight. One remote consulting project became 3, then a steady line of quiet assignments. And each one carried the same evidence Dean had spent years trying to erase from me, that I was still professionally legible under my own hands. Megan scrolled through the files, stopped at a payment receipt, looked back at me, and I could feel the room shift because the numbers, dates, and approvals were doing what grief could not. I told her I had chosen Ren because it felt spare and difficult to sentimentalize, which was exactly what I needed while living inside a marriage built on polished surfaces. I had not done this to prepare for an affair, or for Brielle Sutton, or even for a divorce I could finally name tonight, but because somewhere in the middle of arranging Dean's life, I had needed proof that mine still existed. The vendor code on the hotel confirmation, the photograph on my phone, and the files open between us made the same point from different directions, that he had been constructing my replacement while I had been constructing my return. Megan leaned over the table, tapped the most recent invoice, and asked how much Dean knew, and I told her nothing because secrecy had been the only room left to me. She kept reading through the portfolio, through the client notes, through the marked revisions, and by the time she reached the last confirmation email, the question in the room was no longer whether I could survive Dean. It was whether he had any idea that while he was trying to move me out of the picture before donor season, I had already built a professional name he could not touch. Dean came to Megan's condo the next morning in a gray cashmere coat, carrying the same controlled face he used at donor dinners when he wanted a room to mistake composure for innocence. He did not apologize, did not ask how I was, and did not mention Brielle Sutton, the hotel suite, or the vendor charge billed through his firm. He only said we needed to handle this quietly, that I was making a dramatic decision in the middle of the holidays, and that there was a prenup for exactly this reason. I let him keep speaking because every word made the structure clearer than anger would have. He talked about discretion, about not letting lawyers turn a private problem into a financial bloodbath, and about how expensive it would be for me to misunderstand the position I was in. Megan stepped into the silence after that, told him any further communication would go through counsel, and the way his face tightened at the word counsel told me he had expected fear to work faster. When the door closed behind him, Megan pulled the prenup from the envelope I had carried out with my hard drive and set it flat under the kitchen light. She read the timing first, then the disclosures, then the signature pages. And what mattered was not one dramatic clause but the pattern on the paper itself. I had signed it too close to the wedding, without my own independent attorney, with financial disclosures from Dean that looked thinner now than they had the day I trusted them, and with a drafting firm already tied to his business world. Megan tapped the section on asset treatment and told me the truth in language clean enough to hold on to. That Illinois was no fault, so adultery alone was not the lever. But the sweet confirmation, the vendor billing, and the money trail behind Brielle could support something far more useful if marital funds had been spent on the affair or if financial disclosure had been manipulated. I looked at the pages again, at my own signature sitting under terms Dean had just tried to weaponize, and understood the prenup was not a shield because the evidence already sitting on Megan's table had started cutting through it. Conrad Pike came to Megan's condo 2 days later, and I knew his name before he sat down because Dean only ever used it with a very particular kind of irritation. He was his business partner, the one Dean described as difficult whenever he meant incorruptible, and he arrived with a thin black folder that he placed on the table without theater. When Megan asked why he was there, he looked at me instead and said he had sent the photograph because by the time I received it, the affair was no longer separate from what Dean was doing inside the firm. He opened the folder and turned the papers toward me one by one, not rushing, not trying to persuade me with anything larger than what the documents already said. There were vendor invoices billed to event categories that did not match any real event output. internal approval chains rerouted around Conrad, reimbursement requests carrying personal travel costs, and scheduling records that placed Brielle Sutton inside transactions she had no clean reason to be handling. The hotel suite on Michigan Avenue was there too, tied back to the same vendor structure from the confirmation on Dean's laptop, which meant the charge I saw on Christmas Eve was not an isolated lie, but part of a system already in motion. Conrad told me he had been tracking discrepancies for months because the numbers kept failing in the same direction, toward Dean and away from oversight. He had saved the headers, the timestamps, the revised approvals, and the payment chronology because Dean had started pushing decisions past him in a pattern sharp enough to look intentional on paper. By the time Conrad reached the photograph, placed last in the folder like punctuation instead of proof, I understood why Brielle had sent it that night. Because a woman helping hide vendor spending had every reason to want me displaced before New Year donor season started. I looked at Brielle's name repeated across invoices, scheduling notes, and payment support, and whatever small room pity might have occupied closed on contact with the evidence. She had not wandered into Dean's life by mistake, and she had not sent that photograph in confusion, because every page in front of me showed the same thing from a different angle. Conrad closed the folder, folded his hands once, and let the silence hold, and I finally saw the shape of the trap clearly enough to name it, because the affair was never just about replacing me in Dean's bed. After Conrad left, Megan kept one hand on the closed folder and gave me 2 legal paths without dressing either one up as mercy. We could move slowly, coordinate with the financial exposure forming around Dean, and let the divorce follow the larger damage, or file immediately and force him to react. I looked at the invoices, the rerouted approvals, and Brielle's name threaded through both, and I knew I did not want my future built around whichever version scared me less. I told Megan I wanted a third option, not slower and not reckless, but timed so Dean would lose control of the story before he understood where else I had been rebuilding. Conrad's documents showed he had used the firm to conceal spending, and the contracts on my hard drive showed I had built income outside the marriage long before Christmas Eve. Those 2 records belonged together because if Dean intended to frame me as dependent and cornered, then timing was not a detail. It was the structure. That was when I called Grant Hollis, the studio founder who had known me only as M. Wren and had hired me entirely on the strength of the work. I sent my real name, the portfolio history, the paid invoices, and the full time-stamped project trail. And when he called back, his voice changed only once. It changed at the beginning, when he understood I had built all of it while living inside Dean's house, and then he said if I was ready, he would confirm everything cleanly. I sat at Megan's kitchen table with Grant's email open beside the suite confirmation from Michigan Avenue and the latest consulting invoice still glowing on my screen. Dean had a shell vendor path, a woman trying to take my place before donor season, and a paper trail that darkened every time we touched it. I had documented work, independent income, and a professional name that existed whether he ever knew it had. And that was when I understood I was not choosing between divorce and collapse at all. Megan filed first thing Monday morning, and the petition did not read like a wife reacting to betrayal, but like a case built from records Dean could not charm away. It asked for dissolution, forensic accounting, document preservation, and immediate review of marital spending tied to the suite charge, the vendor trail, and the reimbursement pattern Conrad had already mapped. She told me, while sliding the draft across the table for my final look, that once this was filed, Dean would have to spend his energy answering paper instead of managing perception. The prenup challenge moved beside it, not as drama, but as a second pressure point built from timing, missing disclosure, and the absence of independent counsel on my side. Grant's confirmation letter went in with my consulting records, the invoice history, and the project timeline showing I had established income long before Christmas Eve forced anything into the open. When Megan sent the full package, and I watched the confirmation receipt land in her inbox, I realized the difference between fear and structure was only evidence arranged in the right order. Dean called 3 times before noon, then sent 6 messages that moved exactly the way his voice always had. First control, then irritation, then a polished version of injury. I did not answer any of them, because the only language that mattered now was already sitting in filed motions: dated contracts, vendor invoices, and preserved email headers. By late afternoon, Conrad texted Megan that 2 major clients had paused active campaigns. One museum board member had suspended a winter benefit review, and Brielle had vanished from every public-facing calendar she usually touched. Nothing had exploded in some cinematic burst, which was exactly why the damage was real. Because systems like Dean's did not collapse from noise. They failed when records started agreeing. The suite confirmation, the shell vendor billing, the rerouted approvals, and Brielle's repeated presence in the support materials were now forcing separate parts of his life to say the same thing. That night, Megan poured coffee, checked one more filing timestamp, and told me quietly, "He does not control the speed anymore." And for the first time since I saw the hotel charge, I believed her. Dean walked into the internal meeting, still dressed like a man who believed presentation could outrun a paper trail. And for years, that belief had carried him farther than honesty ever needed to. By then, though, the filed motions, the paused client work, and the preserved vendor records had already stripped the room of anything he could still manage by tone. Conrad was there. Counsel was there. And the same rerouted approvals Dean thought looked invisible inside. A workflow now looked deliberate, once laid side by side. He tried to speak first, which was exactly what I expected from a man who had always mistaken the first voice for the winning one. But the issue was no longer his version of events, because the shell vendor invoices matched the suite charge, the reimbursement trail matched the dates, and Brielle's internal handling sat across both. What failed him in that room was not emotion, not scandal, not gossip, but paperwork that had started agreeing with itself faster than he could contradict it. Brielle did not last much longer once the same records reached the people whose names mattered to her professionally. She could distance herself from Dean in private, but she could not explain away the drafts she sent, the calendars she controlled, or the charges she helped move. By the time Megan called to update me, Brielle was no longer appearing on public event materials, and that detail landed harder than any apology ever could have. My part of the story was happening somewhere cleaner, which was exactly why it held. I signed my partnership letter with Grant, using my real name, with my consulting history, paid invoices, and portfolio work already standing behind me like witnesses who did not need rehearsing. When Megan reached me afterward and said the temporary rulings were going our way, that the spending review would continue and the prenup challenge remained alive, I felt the ground settle differently under my feet. The final settlement did not arrive like fantasy money or some dramatic reversal dressed up to flatter me. It came the way real repair comes in this country. Through signed terms, reviewed numbers, recoverable assets, and the quiet relief of knowing Dean could no longer bleed time until I broke. What mattered most was not the amount attached to my name, but that the amount existed beside documented work, independent income, and a life that no longer required his permission. A few weeks later, at the soft opening of the new studio, Conrad arrived, carrying a black sketchbook, and handed it to me with the same restraint he had brought to every part of this. There was no performance in it, only recognition. And after everything Dean had taken by turning me into an extension of his image, recognition felt larger than romance. I stood by the front window with the sketchbook in my hands and understood the full circle of it at last, because Dean had lost the narrative, the seat, and the room, while I had returned to my own name and found that it was still enough. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If any part of it felt familiar, or if it gave you a little strength tonight, leave a comment and share it with someone who might need that same reminder. Subscribe if you want more stories about starting over, finding your footing again, and choosing a life that finally feels like your own.